All right. Welcome, everyone, to the latest in our series of programming around the American Jewish experience in medicine. The title of today's program is Nuremberg Memories and the Founding of American Bioethics. This is the fourth of this series, sponsored by Dr. Helen Morris. And so I have to start by acknowledging and thanking Helen for her gift that has allowed us to really explore these experiences in this unique and influential history. The first of these are all on our website if you want to, if this is the first you're seeing. The first one took place last year and was about the legacy of Jewish health professionals in Colorado and the legacy of treatment of tuberculosis here, in which the local Jewish medical community was and remains quite influential. And then we did a terrific follow-up program later in the spring last year on medical racism and the linkages between racism against the Jewish community and other communities. And then we had another wonderful program in the early fall on Jewish bioethics. Sort of what should people who are not from the Jewish faith tradition know about bioethics in the Jewish faith and the ways in which that tradition has influenced contemporary bioethics. So today's program will feature Dr. Bob Baker, and I have to say it came about because I was asked to be a peer reviewer for a book that he has coming out. And I was just so taken by this book and the story that he has to tell about whistleblowers and the people in the wake of World War II who were able to remember the Nuremberg medical trial when most of the rest of the American medical community really wanted to put it behind us and not think about it very much. And so today we're going to start with a presentation by our keynote, Bob Baker, and then we will have two panelists who will join us to comment on Bob's talk, and then we'll have plenty of time for conversation. Please put your questions in the Q&A if you don't mind, and you're welcome to start queuing questions early in the program. And then let me start by just introducing Bob. Thank you for turning your camera on, just on cue, Dr. Baker. Dr. Robert Baker is the William D. Williams Professor of Philosophy at Union College and is Professor of Bioethics and the founding director of the Clarkson University Icahn Mount Sinai Bioethics program, now emeritus in that position. He serves on the editorial board of Bioethics, has been a 4-time National Endowment for the Humanities awardee, and is a Hastings Center Fellow. Bob has written, edited, or co-edited over a dozen books, including some that have, at least for me, been extremely influential in my thinking. One called The American Medical Ethics Revolution, another called Before Bioethics, another The Structure of Moral Revolutions, and I think he'll probably talk a little today about his forthcoming book. Dr. Baker has served as a consultant to the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities for the committee that developed the Ethics Code for Healthcare Ethics Consultants. And he and I worked together on a report that eventually prompted the American Medical Association to apologize publicly for its past treatment of African-American physicians. Bob, I will turn things over to you and then we'll introduce the panelists after you're finished and before they start.
So may I have my slides, please? Could you roll up to the first slide? Roll back. Okay, thank you. And so that's my titles and so on. And Matt gave the title of the talk. Next slide, please. Okay. This started with the book before the one I'm working on now, which was a book about moral revolutions. And it's these inversions of morality throughout the 19th century. And in the early 20th century, for example, abortion was deemed killing in utero, and it was deemed an absolute sin, wrong in every way. And then all of a sudden in mid-20th century, that inverted, and abortion by 1970 was deemed a right available to every citizen of the United States. And those transformations, those inversions of morality, those are the things that intrigue me. And I also thought that the change in the physician-patient relationship was the artifacts of a moral revolution, and I intended to document that in this book, The Structure of Moral Revolutions. And the interesting thing about moral revolutions is that they are revolutions against some set of established set of beliefs and against establishment figures. And so in the one case, it was the religious establishment with respect to abortion. In the other case, it was a medical establishment with respect to patients' rights. And I was very curious as to why these dissidents were able to do this. And it turned out that most of the dissidents who were involved in the Anglo-American bioethics revolutions had knowledge of the Nuremberg Trials or the Nuremberg Code. In fact, virtually every whistleblower, one of the dissidents who were involved in informing the public about things that were immoral had this knowledge. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this is a reminder that it was not just, if you're going to have a moral revolution, not all the dissidents are going to be whistleblowers. There has to be a broad sense of dissatisfaction with the way things are. And this is a slide portraying a protest by the National Welfare Rights Organization, which from 1970 through 1972 got the Joint Commission for the Accreditation of Healthcare Institutions and the American Hospital Association to accept a patient's Bill of Rights. And they did so, as you can see, by going out on picket lines, by saying we have our rights, and by convincing these organizations, by embarrassing these organizations into granting these rights. So there was a groundswell of dissident activities. And then there were a group I call lumpen intelligentsia. That's a group of oddball intellectuals who got together to make these protests into something tangible, legislation, regulation, new ideas, and to justify them. Next slide, please. Now, what all of these Jewish and non-Jewish dissidents had in mind was knowledge of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunals, which took place between 1945 and 1946. I think the last was 1947. But you can see the standard picture of this. And the purposes of these trials were twofold. First, obviously, to punish the doctors who did these awful things, but also to distinguish those doctors from respectable German professionals, physicians, nurses, lawyers, and so on, who were needed to resurrect German society. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, among the doctors who were tried and convicted for these war crimes were Dr. Karl Brandt, who was the designer of the child euthanasia program, which killed children with disabilities, whether or not they were Jewish. Dr. Josef Mengele, who did experiments on twins. And they were, in all these cases, the experimental subjects gave no form of consent to being experimented on. They were convicted, but at the end of their convictions, the judges read out a statement on permissible research on humans. They also included grounds on which these doctors were convicted, but they ended with this statement of permissible research on humans, which was an odd kind of ending in a way. And the reason for that, next slide, please, was that this physician, he was a PhD in pathology and an MD, Andrew C. Ivy, he conceived of the idea of trying the Nazi doctors because he wanted to establish a statement on morally permissible experiments to distinguish the uncivil, immoral experiments of the Nazi doctors and the morally permissible experiments conducted every day by civilized researchers in Britain, the United States, France, and had been done earlier in Germany. So that was his idea. He got this idea in 1946. He got it accepted because he was a representative of the American Medical Association. It became part of the war crimes agenda, and he insisted that the trials end with this statement of morally permissible experiments. He was deeply concerned that knowledge of these impermissible experiments would be generalized to all experiments, and it would end up with delegitimizing medical experimentation on humans and to a certain extent even on animals worldwide, and thus stop medical progress. Next slide, please. So he worked in combination. His ideals would have been worthless except for the work of Leo Alexander, who was an Austrian-American Jewish refugee. Ivy was Protestant. I have no idea. He came out of a nonviolent, anti-war Protestant minority background, which was kind of interesting. Ivy accepted a commission in the U.S. As in charge of the medical branch of the U.S. Navy, but himself did not accept formally a medical the role of lieutenant colonel. So he was treading a needle there. Leo Alexander was an Austro-American Jew. He grew up in an elite middle-class family. They entertained Freud. They entertained Jewish composers and writers. And when the Anschluss, when the German takeover of Austria occurred, most of these members of his family had to flee Austria, Austro-Germany. Alexander was in China on a Rockefeller scholarship, and he fled to the United States. He originally started out working for nothing but room and board. When the war broke out, he volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army. He became an expert on shell shock, now called basically shell shock at that time, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And he became a Nazi hunter because he had been educated in Berlin, because he had dined with and known many of these people accused of war crimes personally. They trusted him. They talked about their experiments. They mentioned in passing that many of the people were Jews. They claimed they were all volunteers. And as soon as he was able to figure out where they had stored their papers, he accessed those papers, and that became the basis of the U.S. prosecution. Alexander himself was initially motivated to make these SOBs pay for what they had done. Eventually, he helped Ivy draft the 10-point document that was called Permissible Experiments on Humans. Now, one of the things that puzzled me was the document was clearly, if you go through the trial transcripts, called Permissible Experiments on Humans. But by the 1960s, it was referred to as the Nuremberg Code. I was very curious about why. And it turned out that Henry Beecher, who I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, was the first person, actually, he did it in an article published in JAMA in 1959 called Experiments in Man. He initially did this because he wanted to talk about this code in the context of the Nazi and German medical experimentation during World War II, and saying that it raised several questions. The most important question it raised for him was something that Matt is well aware of and has thought a lot about, and that is what went wrong was the deprofessionalization of German medicine, so that German medicines had become state biological officers. And the big point that Beecher drew out of his study of the Nazi medical experiments, one of the big points, was that it was important for doctors to remain an independent profession. They should never give up their relationship to individual patients and persons in favor of their duties to society, and any documents eliciting duties to society as primary or as of utmost importance should be deemed unprofessional and should be rejected by the medical profession. He also believed it was important for the medical profession to monitor himself. He believed in IRBs as long as the people on it were healthcare professionals. And I'm going to let that sit for a while because there are much more interesting things about his case. The Nuremberg Code, however, there are two standard histories of bioethics, one by Al Johnson, The Birth of Bioethics. I should have taken it off my bookshelf, but I'm not going to do it right this moment. And the other was David Rothman's earlier Strangers at the Bedside. And those are still the standard histories of bioethics. Neither emphasizes very much the Nuremberg Code, although Johnson deplores the Declaration of Helsinki. He critiques it because it doesn't up to the standard set by the Nuremberg Code, although he himself thinks that the Nuremberg Code was not integral to American bioethics. This book and the book before it, the two books, you can look at them on your slide, Schmidt's book about Alexander and the book about justice at Nuremberg, the prior book, are both standard books on the development of the Nuremberg Code. They are not only the first word, but in many ways the last word on the subject, and I endorse them very heartily. They were very influential on my writings. Next slide, please. I gotta hurry up. This is a statement from David Rothman. He says, well into the 1960s, the American research community considered Nuremberg findings and Nuremberg Code irrelevant to its own work. Now, if you stop for a second and think about the source of that statement, he's talking about the American research community, citing doctors at Harvard and places like that, at the Harvard medical schools and places like that. And if you think back on structure of moral revolution, I looked to a different source, dissidents. And it turned out universally, the dissidents, the people who wanted to criticize American medical medicine of the 1950s and 1960s, all cite the Nuremberg Code and were in many ways influenced by it. The other book I was referencing was Weinlig's Nazi Medicine and the Nuremberg Trials, and he directly links the Nuremberg Code with the birth of bioethics. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this is a chronology of early bioethics in the 60s and 70s. I want you to look at the material in yellow and the material in blue. If you take a look at the material in yellow, Gibson, who's the first of the whistleblowers protesting the Tuskegee study, he attended the Nuremberg trial and Nuremberg trials and knew about them because he witnessed them. And he was a Christian at the time. He was initially he was a branch of he was Catholic. No, not at the time. He was Roman Catholic at the time. He later became part of Dorothy Day's Roman Catholic workers movement, which was direct action, nonviolent, and it eventually becomes a Russian Orthodox. Papworth is Jewish, and he states that the Nuremberg Code influenced him to write Human Guinea Pigs, a warning, the first of his publications on the subject. Henry Beecher, he was a Methodist, and he's the first one to call the Nuremberg Code that I know. He did it in 1959 in an article in JAMA. Schatz is Jewish, and he again invokes the Nuremberg Code to protest the Tuskegee syphilis study. Buxton's father was Jewish. I'm not clear what his own religious leanings are, or whether he was religious in any way. But he again cites the Nuremberg Code in criticizing the Tuskegee syphilis studies. Dan Callahan was Roman Catholic, and I'm not sure when or if actually he gives much credence to the Nuremberg Code. He usually references later documents. Will Galen was Jewish, and he defended the Nuremberg Code, so he obviously knew about it. And together, Callahan and Galen established the Hastings Center, which was the first of the Bioethics Institute in the same year. Medical school educators do much the same. And George Wiley is going to lead the NWR protest for patients' rights. He's Black, he's a Methodist. So there's a mix of Christians and Jews, not clear that many or Jews except for Papworth were particularly religious. Papworth clearly was. Next slide, please. Again, there's many protests against organized medicine at that time, against the practices of the hospital, and joining the protest were the women's movements in 1970-71 in Our Bodies, Ourselves. Next, please. This is a chronology. They publicize a patient bill of rights. In 71, the Kennedy Institute, Helligers is Roman Catholic, never leaves the religion. Dan Callahan is apostate. He definitely leads the religion. This book, I don't know if you must be able to see me. This book was my entry, how I learned about the Nuremberg Code. It was written in 1972 by J. Katz, who himself was a refugee from the Holocaust, and Alex Capron, both nominally Jewish. I'm not sure whether they practice or not. And they both publicized the Nuremberg trial extensively in their book. Peter Buxton, again, his father was Jewish, I'm not sure, but he raises it in his charges against the Tuskegee. And I worked with Gabe Kamowitz, and I learned about the Nuremberg Code because I was with Paul Lowinger, who was a fellow civil rights activist, and we were both involved in nonviolent civil rights activism and in something called New Detroit, in rebuilding Detroit after the so-called riots. We called them the insurrection, the African-American insurrection, and we were both living in Detroit at the time, and we brought up a legal brief citing patients' rights using the Nuremberg Code, and the court accepted the Nuremberg Code as part of international law and brought it to bear in their decision. In 1973, the same year, the AHA affirmed the Patient's Bill of Rights, and in 1973, bioethics becomes a discipline. I want to slow down for a second. I'm running out of time, so I'm doing stuff very quickly. And I was a stutterer as a kid, so sometimes it comes out. I believe that the creation of bioethics like a discipline is just like the creation of women's studies as a discipline and a scholarly field, and just like African American studies as a scholarly field and subject, a discipline in universities and colleges. All of that comes out of is established by protest movements. And my general theory is that the protest of the National Welfare Rights Organization and of the women's rights organizations are part of what is against organized medicine, are part of what leads to the birth of bioethics. And what the institutes do is they legitimize these protest movements and give them a nice academic veneer to allow them to be recognized by medical institutions like healthcare organizations and so on. Next, please. Okay, that just says what I just said, so I'm going to flip to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about Henry Beecher. And I'm sorry, I'm going to run over about 7 more minutes. Beecher used Nazi data. He conducted experiments for the CIA, for the US Army, on Harvard students, often on without their consent or with misleading consent during the Cold War and throughout the Cold War. And I'll come back to that. So next slide, please. Okay. He was also a critic of the Nuremberg Code. First, because it was an attempt to establish an international humanitarian law being the operative word. And he preferred the code, he preferred professional self-regulation. And so he didn't want external regulation because he thought that was the road down, in his words, to Hitlerian medicine, to the state calling on doctors to do immoral things rather than hew to the medicine of the ethics of the profession. Moreover, he thought it was flawed. The first principle of the Nuremberg Code was the requirement for informed voluntary consent of the patient, but it provided for no surrogacy, and that, as he pointed out, would cripple, if not eliminate, most research in the field of mental disease, all researches on physical disease, on the mentally ill, and on children. And he's got a long list of this critique, and he said it's bad law, but he supported the Declaration of Helsinki because, you guessed it, that was a declaration of a set of norms for research produced by physicians, for physicians, and so he could support it. He was not against regulating human subjects experiments. Experiments on human subjects, but he believed that ought to have been by the profession, not by any external body. Next, please. Okay. Beecher became an international correspondent with Maurice Papworth. You might think the two men had nothing in common. Both belonged to minority religions which were not respected within their respective cultures. Papworth had, according to one account, a line posted above his desk saying, "No Jew can be a gentleman." Once, twice, or many other times in his life, he was turned down for positions because he was Jewish. And in one case, somebody says, "I don't want to work with you. You're a Jew. I want to work with fellow gentlemen. No Jew can be a gentleman." And more officially, he was turned down for admission from the Royal College of Physicians because it stated in a letter, as everyone knows, this is a gentleman's society. And again, no Jew can be a gentleman. Eventually, the Royal Society nominated and elected a Jew to be its head. And this head immediately went to Papworth and said, "I'm forcing them to admit them. You are now admitted to the society." And so a few months before his death, Papworth was admitted. He was forced to be an outsider. His students he taught privately. His students kept regaling him with tales of unethical experimentation. He put these tales together in a statement on television and before in a popular magazine, and he published this piece, "Human Guinea Pigs." Beecher contacts him, and the two become international pen pals. No, I don't have a copy. Do I have a copy of Beecher's book? Well, I thought I had it on my, yeah, I've got it. Sorry. This is Papworth's book. Next slide, please. And this is Beecher's book, and the two struggled later to produce books on what they do. That slide is Beecher at his prime in his Harvard office in 1966, at the time in which he blew the ultimate whistleblowing article in Medicine, in which he outs 22 experiments. He did this knowing that he had conducted unethical experiments. He did this knowing that he was going to create a lot of, as he put it, blowback, and yet he risked his acceptance by the medical community. He risked everything to do this, knowing that it might lead to his ostracism and so on. He is the only person who conducted unethical experiments to whistleblow and say they are unethical. By the way, Dan Callahan was one of his human guinea pigs, and one of his Harvard students he used as a human guinea pigs. I can discuss that in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Okay, the experiment that blew it all open is the Public Health Service's Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where he promised African Americans, poor African Americans, farmers in the South, treatment for bad blood, which is a popular name for syphilis, when in fact they were not being treated, they were being left untreated for the rest of their lives. Next, please. This was public knowledge. This is from JAMA, which is the most widely read in 1964, and I believe still today, medical journal published in the United States, perhaps in English. And if you look at it, it says the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it says beginning in the 1963 marks the 30th year of this study. And that's all I want from this slide. This was public knowledge. Next, please. Okay. It's blown by, the whistleblower is by Peter Buxton. He was born in Prague of a Jewish father. He served as a combat medic in World War II. After he came out as a civilian, he worked as a contact tracer for the CDC, Public Health Service. He learns that public health doctors are told not to treat syphilis in some black men. He's shocked. He compares this to the Nazi doctors at Dachau, which he knew about because his non-Jewish grandfather or uncle, I forget which, served in the Nazi army, probably uncle, served in the Nazi army and told about all the atrocities there. And when he was a student in, I believe, Oregon State University, he took courses on the Holocaust. And so he wrote a report saying this is like the Nazi doctors. The report was rejected. He sent a letter to the head of the venereal disease division of the CDC, pointing out all the similarities. He said, forget about it. Eventually, he was called down to UPS headquarters, and they said, look, kid, forget about it. He eventually knew that he was going to be let go from the USP Public Health Service, CDC, and so he quit. He goes to law school. At the first year, all of his professors say, hey, kids, forget about it. He runs into someone from the Associated Press. He tells her the story. She goes to AP headquarters. They send out a more experiment reporter, and you'll see Gene Heller's report in a second. It breaks in several Washington newspapers and the New York Times. It captures the eye of Senator Ted Kennedy, who holds hearings. They passed the National Research Act, which calls for hearings on the ethics of human subjects, experimentation on human subjects. They issue a Belmont report. The Belmont report becomes the basis of Beecher and Childress's principles of biomedical ethics, and bioethics becomes an established field. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what breaks the camel's back. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The study was conducted, to get the second paragraph down, for autopsies that were not going to treat them throughout their lives. Untreated, lie about them, say that they're being treated for syphilis. Next slide, please. Okay. Now I want to make a distinction between whistleblowers and whistleblowing moralists. Whistleblowers expose things that everybody in their society can recognize is immoral. The wider community recognizes it. The law, somehow, you say they did this, it's wrong. It's said in the New York Times article and in all of Hiller's articles. They were going to be told, they were told they were being treated, and they were left untreated so that the United States Public Health Service could autopsy their cadavers. Nobody saw that as immoral. A whistleblowing moralist is somebody who, recognizing that somebody tolerated or deemed morally or acceptable in the wider community, but it seems to the moralist that they're wrong, that they're blind to immorality. And I like to quote the Hebrew Bible on this. This is from Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of those prophets claimed by in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. O foolish people without understanding, which have eyes and see not, which have ears and hear not. You know, the world was morally blind. Beecher and the other and Buxton made the world aware of this. I am done. My apologies to everybody for running 13 minutes over. I'm sorry.
Sorry, having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you so much. Very provocative, interesting talk. So I'm going to ask Ira Bedzo to bring his video back on. Dr. Bedzo is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's head of the unit of the International Chair in Bioethics for the World Medical Association Cooperation Center. His interests relate to understanding the ethical implications of biotechnology and healthcare policy, as well as how organizations can create an ethical culture through values-driven leadership. Dr. Bedzo is co-director of the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust, a longtime partner on our programming at the center here in Colorado, and a regular contributor in Forbes for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion section. He is also an Orthodox rabbi, Yora Yadin Yadin, and a valued partner, of course, in our Aspen Ethical Leadership Program. He didn't put that on his bio, but I'm drawing it out for you anyways.
Yeah,
Ira,
maybe I should have. I'm sorry about that.
Really, I'm looking forward to your comments on Bob's interesting thesis.
Thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. Hold on. All right, so I'm going to speak about, in particular, whistleblowing. Although there's so much that I could say given Bob's talk, but I'm going to limit myself to the 10 minutes. Talk about whistleblowing, and before I even talk about it, I wanted to say a couple of things. The first is I don't want it to be thought, or I don't want to make it seem as if to be a whistleblower you have to be Jewish or Christian, or that Jews have a genetic predisposition to whistleblowing. I also don't want to make it seem as if Judaism stands in this world or is justified in this world as an avenue for cultural critique or to ensure justice. Really what I'm looking to do is, just as we might analyze from various ethical perspectives what whistleblowing is, why it could or should be done, and what are some of the benefits or detriments to whistleblowing in society, I'll look at whistleblowing from a different legal/ethical framework and analyze it from the text of the Jewish tradition. So first off, with regards to the Jewish tradition, I should just make note that the Jewish tradition can be seen either as a legal tradition or as an ethical tradition, or both. That could speak to the authority of legal texts or Jewish legal texts in terms of its observance as well as forcing compliance. It can also speak to the nature of using juridical language and concepts to speak about ethical questions. How I want to kind of look at it and play with it a little bit is recognize that even if I'm looking at Jewish legal texts, they had ethical implications, and they can be seen as really trying to imagine how one should act in this world, whether through law or through ethics, given the complexity of the world that people were embedded in. So let me go through a few texts just so we can get started to get some idea for the question and answer. So obviously the first text I'm going to take is from the Bible. Where else would you start if you were going to think about Jewish ethics and whistleblowing? So I'm going to bring one verse from Leviticus, which has three parts to it. So the first part is, you shall not go as a talebearer or speak rumors or speak improperly among your people. The second part says, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. And the third part is, I am the Lord. So certain biblical scholars will look at this verse and say, oh, this verse is giving two separate yet equal but distinct commandments. One of, don't go around speaking rumors, whether they're true or not. Talebearing in the Jewish tradition, or lashon hara, as they say, is not simply gossip of things that are not true, but even things that are true. Well, also, you shouldn't stand idly by in the blood of your neighbor, which people will then interpret as, if you see someone in distress or in danger, you should save them. So the Talmudic sages actually, while they do recognize that not standing idly by the blood of your neighbor does speak to saving someone in distress, they do not see the two parts, or the first two parts of this verse, as separate and distinct. They see that there is a balance that is needed, or a necessity that is needed, to imagine when you speak of something that you see versus when you should not speak of something that you see. And they interpret, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, as connoting a commandment to testify in a court, which means that there are often times when, if you see something, you let people have their privacy. But if it comes at the expense of someone, and blood here is not translated literally only as terms of physical danger, but also a monetary or social danger. If you see someone in trouble, you should go to the courts and tell them. And you should try to rectify the situation or save the person from that distress. And in that case, you're not being a talebearer. You are seeking justice. So then the third part of this verse, I am the Lord. I mean, obviously you could say, someone who keeps the Bible would say that's an obvious statement. Why does it need to be said? The reason oftentimes the last part of this verses, have I am the Lord, tend to connote something that's hidden that only God could see. So the sages, or the Talmudic sages, look at phrases like I am the Lord to say there must be something within the balance of these two commandments that intentionality matters, right? Like, are you speaking for the enjoyment, quote unquote, of talebearing, or are you speaking for seeking of justice? So this balance then, yes, centuries later, but this balance has been part of Talmudic and rabbinic discussion in terms of when is speaking out appropriate and when should one not speak out. So the clearest or most detailed delineation of how to have this balance actually comes from Rabbi Israel Meir Cohen Kagan, who was born in 1838, passed away in 1933. He lived in Belarus and was the rabbi of the town of Radin, and then started a rabbinical school or yeshiva in Radin. He's known as, among many things, as the Chafetz Chaim, which comes from a verse that says, who is one who desires life? Someone who doesn't speak ill of one's neighbor. So he's known as someone who was we would use the term today, a thought leader in how to balance speaking out versus holding one's tongue. So he wrote that disclosure of wrongdoing is permissible under the following conditions. One, the objective is to achieve a legitimate benefit, which goes to making sure you're not standing idly by as opposed to the desire to talebear. The whistleblower is certain of the crime or transgression based on firsthand knowledge. This isn't a matter of hearsay. The third one is actually quite interesting in the respect of, is whistleblowing a first resort or a second or last resort? The whistleblower is certain that the transgressor will not desist and make necessary amends, which really means before one goes and whistleblows, can one rectify the situation on one's own accord? Just as Bob mentioned, that whistleblowers are ones who see something that's going on in an organization that needs to be called out. Can one fix what's going on in the organization before having to bring in someone from the outside? The fourth is that the whistleblower is certain that the report will be efficacious or taken seriously. There's no value, according to Rabbi Kagan, of calling something out that will not affect change. And then, importantly, that the report is accurate and not exaggerated. This speaks to the original interpretation of "you shall not stand idly by" of being able to testify in a court, right? So if the testimony in court has to be accurate and not exaggerated, so too should whistleblowing be accurate and not exaggerated. The last 2 points that Rabbi Kagan makes creates a lot of difficulty, especially when you see the Jewish tradition as an ethical tradition and not simply a legal tradition, right? If you see it as a legal tradition, then saying that a Jewish court should decide the case, or if the whistleblower will cause a transgressor to suffer more severe penalties than what is due to him under Jewish law, disclosure should not be made. If you see Jewish law as a legal system or simply as a legal system, then this isn't very difficult. It's a jurisprudential matter of who has the authority to ensure that people comply to Jewish law. Those the courts that are authorized by Jewish law to decide these types of cases. However, from an ethical perspective, it becomes quite difficult to say if a Jew sees something, whether that a Jew or a non-Jew is doing in a company or in society that's wrong, that the only avenue to speak up is going to a Jewish court. And moreover, that the Jewish tradition has moral priority over a non-Jewish moral tradition in terms of what should be the consequences of the transgressor to whom one is whistleblowing, right? So the question of how does now the Jewish ethical tradition or the Jewish legal tradition now speak to whistleblowing in a multicultural environment, the rules or the description of the Chafetz Chaim or Rabbi Kagan seems to be too parochial. Thank God he's not the only person who speaks of this. Contemporary and historical rabbis have gone to see the efficacy of whistleblowing or a Jewish community or a member of a Jewish community speaking out to broader authorities spoke to or relates to the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the countries in which they live, as well as the legitimacy of the non-Jewish legal system. And when I say legitimacy here doesn't necessarily mean does it have the power to enforce its laws. It speaks more to the HLA Hart perspective of the authority of a government or of a political society speaks to the consent of the governed in a way that consent speaks to moral principles and values. So in the 15th century, Rabbi Caro, or the 16th century, Rabbi Caro, who was known as the great codifier of Jewish law and is still the major authority among Spanish, North African, and Middle Eastern Jews. He writes that it is forbidden to hand a Jew over to Gentiles, whether the Jew is person or property. This applies even if the Jew is wicked and sinful, and even if he causes continual problems. And anyone who hands over a Jew to Gentiles, whether they're person or their property, does not have a share in the world to come. So if you take Rabbi Caro's ruling at face value, it seems as if regardless of the commandment in Leviticus, Jews should not be whistleblowers. And all the more so should they not be whistleblowers that it would be such a grave sin that they don't have a share in heaven if they do so. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, who is the European, I want to say the European version of Rabbi Yosef Karo, by which I mean also alive in the 16th century, but for the authority that Rabbi Caro had among as far as Spanish, North African, and Middle Eastern Jews, Rabbi Isserlis had for European Jews. He's not as dogmatic in the statement. He has two comments in the same chapter in the legal code that broadens and makes more flexible the prohibition of handing over someone to the non-Jewish authorities. So first he says, if a person strikes his fellow, one may take him to a Gentile authorities, even if it will cause great harm. The second is if a person is engaged in counterfeiting or fraud, and one suspects that it will hurt many people, first you warn him not to engage in it. But if he doesn't listen, you can hand him over to a Gentile's authorities, saying that he is the only one engaged in such practices. Now, if you notice the two examples that Rabbi Isserles gives, the handing over to non-Jewish authorities speaks to the nature, or the permission to hand over to non-Jewish authorities speaks to the nature of the crime, right? If someone is striking one's fellow, basically he's a violent individual who is causing internal societal conflict of a physical nature, right? This isn't someone who's simply just, or can be interpreted as somebody not simply who's not physically abusive, but in all areas of abuse, one can take that person to the Gentile authorities, which is, in other words, one can either whistleblow or hand over for legal action. The other one is not physical abuse, but is counterfeiting and fraud, which in this respect shows that the damages that one can cause others economically or financially will have major consequences to the society itself. Such a person, even if the Gentile government is one that doesn't have that type of just authority, but simply exists by virtue of their power or their coercion, should still be the authority of last resort for this type of individual. Meaning, this is not something that simply becomes an internal conflict, but becomes a societal conflict or societal problem, where Rabbi Isserles would say that one can hand over such a person, such that you would be fulfilling the commandment of not standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. So if you notice, what Rabbi Caro has a black and white ideological never to hand over, Rabbi Isserles, from just a broad brush, would say, well, it depends on the nature of the crime. If the crime is bad enough or is harmful enough, then that person should be handed over. Whistleblowing should be an option. There's one other way that people looked at the nature of balancing talebearing and handing over someone or whistleblowing to authorities that wasn't simply based on the nature of the crime, but here based on the efficacy and truth, the justness of the result of whistleblowing. So Rabbi Yechiel Michael Halevi Epstein was alive around the same time as Rabbi Kagan. And he writes specifically that the rules of Rabbi Caro and even Rabbi Isserles and the prohibitions to whistleblow to the greater community or to hand over someone to the Gentile authorities was really based on the idea that handing someone over to the non-Jewish authorities would not lead to a just outcome. It would either cause more harm than good to the individual, more harm than good to the Jewish community, or more harm than good to the multicultural community at large. However, it's funny that he uses the example of the czar, but take it as you may. If there is a country whose government is just and whose laws are legitimate, and where the country rules by the rule of law, then this question of informing or whistleblowing is no longer prohibited. Not only is it no longer prohibited, but contemporary rabbis who have recognized a fundamental change between rule by power versus rule by authority will recognize that whistleblowing is considered a moral act when it will save people from harm, whether that harm be financial harm or any level of abuse, whether it's psychological, sexual, or physical abuse. So again, when Bob talked about who the whistleblowers were and whether they were Catholic or Methodist or Jewish, I don't want to say, well, the Jewish whistleblowers obviously knew all of these texts or were infused with an ethos that came from the Jewish tradition. But at the same time, what I would like to leave with you is that whistleblowing is a moral act. It is a recognition of a harm. It is a recognition of one's power and ability to ameliorate that harm. And it is an act that recognizes the efficacy of making change. That is not simply just a discussion, whether it's right or wrong, or whether it's good or bad in terms of the process and the consequences. That's discussed in secular philosophy and medical ethics. But other traditions, such as the Jewish tradition, has robust discussions over what can one say, how can one say it, when can one speak out, and what should their intentions be when they do so. So that's my response to the great talk that Bob gave, and I'm looking forward to having more discussion in the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Ira. And I have a couple questions teed up for you, but let's turn first to Dr. Sabine Hildebrandt for her comments on Bob's talk, and you're welcome to comment on Ira's as well as we go through. Dr. Hildebrandt teaches anatomy and history of anatomy at Harvard Medical School and Harvard College. Her research interests are the history and ethics of anatomy, and her educational approach integrates anatomy, medical history, and medical ethics. Among other publications, she's written on medicine, Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust. Her 2016 book, The Anatomy of Murder: Ethical Transgressions and Anatomical Science During the Third Reich, is the first to systematically study anatomy in Nazi Germany. Most recently, she's researched the history of the Anatomical Institute as a member of the Historical Commission on the Rijksuniversiteit Strasbourg, 1941 to 44, and she currently serves as co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Medicine and the Holocaust: Historical Evidence, Implications for Today, Teaching for Tomorrow. Dr. Hildebrandt also is a member of the American Association for Anatomy Task Forces on Legacy Collections, and she serves as associate editor of Anatomical Sciences Education for the areas of history and ethics. Thanks for being with us today, Sabine. I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much for having me here. My head is buzzing with all the different ideas. And just for once, I'm not coming with a PowerPoint presentation, so please bear with me. I'm not drawing from a formal framework of ethics or philosophy in my work. Rather, I draw from various different disciplines in my thinking. And when I listened to Dr. Baker's presentation, that he actually had headlined with a thesis: moral revolutions are created by dissidents and not by establishments. I have various thoughts here, and I'm mostly interested in motivations and the psychology behind it all. I see various questions that Dr. Baker brought up. First of all, why were mid-century Anglo-American medical practitioners morally blind to unethical human experiments? And then the second question I see as, what characteristics do dissidents or whistleblowers have in common? What motivates them? The question is, why do a certain set of people just go on with what they've always done? And what makes others be completely different and be able to see what could be morally wrong? And Dr. Baker has offered some possible approaches to answering this question of who is a dissident and who is a whistleblower. He has highlighted religion. He has not highlighted national backgrounds, but certainly religious backgrounds. And I think that touches on some of the explanations behind this. I think what religion gives us is a certain set of values, but I also believe that these values can come from other domains of our human life. And I would certainly think that it comes also from certain experiences that we have had in our personal lives. And it is not so much knowledge, for example, there was another explanation that Dr. Beecher offered, a knowledge of the Nazi atrocities and the Nuremberg Trials that made the dissidents realize the potential of the Nuremberg Code. But I think it's also the personal experience of, for example, having themselves been persecuted in a certain set of the dissidents. The word dissident means literally to stand apart. So these are people who have experienced that they are either by where they have been placed by society that they stand apart, or that they have moved away from the general part of society. Does that make them able to see what's happening in the main establishment, for example, in medicine? That's a question we have to ask here. Certainly we have from the German background, which I'm very familiar with, people who are not identified religiously, but who have the experience of coming out of perpetrator families and who know of the knowledge and have experienced the horror of having been born into such a family, for example, that makes them able to see differences. What really is interesting for me, and that's a question I would like to discuss with with Dr. Beecher and also Dr. Bedzo here and the audience, if possible, is what made Beecher change his mind? I mean, Beecher is the man, and I've looked at his estate papers, who in 1945 received the first reports of medical experiments that have been gathered by the US military. Specifically, they went into the concentration camps and gathered the results of experiments and sent them to 60 specialists in the United States to assess whether there was anything in there that should be used for American medicine. And so he had these papers, and he was looking at them. He was asked to look at the mescaline experiments, and he later then, lo and behold, during the Cold War, used hallucinogenic drugs, not necessarily mescaline, but others, in his own experiments. And he did that until, I mean, essentially 20 years, for the next 20 years. And then he started to think differently. And that's a conundrum for me. How was he able to learn to see? That is a question. He, by the way, got something very wrong. The Nazi physicians were not forced by the state. They came to the state and asked for the opportunities. Very problematically, Russia in the Dachau experiments, he came to Himmler and gave him the idea to take concentration camp prisoners for medical experiments. That was not Himmler's idea. That was a physician's idea. And they used the scientific rationale in many of these experiments. Even Mengele still used the scientific rationale of medical science at the time. The same scientific rationale that was used by physicians throughout the world at the time, and continuing into the 50s and 60s in the United States, among other places. So that was still ongoing. So again, I do not have an answer to the question, what enabled Beecher to change his mind? And I think this is where the real interest for us is. How do we learn to see? We have certain moral compasses that we have, hopefully each one of us developed. How do we make them work? And how can we change our mind about certain things? This is what I'm interested in. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hildebrandt, for those comments. And of course, I'm going to just go straight into the questions that are coming in from the audience.
Matt,
I had my own questions.
Matt, may I speak directly to Dr. Hildebrandt?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Bob. Is I would love to see if we can just have the three of you sort of answer each other's questions to get started. I hear within, Sabine, within your comments are some of the things that came up in the Q&A already. So I think we're gonna be able to jump in and hopefully get through most of the Q&A questions. Bob, go ahead.
So if you take a look at what Beecher was writing and publishing, and some of the papers that he wrote for reports he wrote. He starts to get troubled sometime in the mid-50s. And then and by the time you get the 1959 papers, the JAMA piece, I thought I wrote it down somewhere in case I had to reference it. Experiments on human beings, I forget but it's that 59 paper. He starts talking and condemning Hitlerian medicine. He does make that, and this sort of thing, and he's more concerned about it. So there's a growing unease. But I think the thing that flips, it's the 1959 JAMA paper, Experimentation in Man. So I think that really tipped him was Papworth's paper. And the two become, as I say, buddies. Now, I want to go to your point. What the Beecher and Papworth have in common? Both came from religions that are frowned down upon, that are disdained in their communities. Beecher was a full immersion Methodist. And this was the idea of fully immersing somebody, and this sort of thing was looked on by other Methodists as kind of primitive, and it's only symbolic and this sort of thing. But he even had his daughter fully. He read the Bible daily by all the biographical accounts. So he's deeply religious at the same time that he's doing it. Papworth, again, deeply religious person, comes from a religion which his colleagues don't accept, the people around him don't accept. Both of them started out as very poor boys. Both of them had to work their way through college and graduate school. Beecher, to be you know this, but the audience may not. His name, and I'm not sure I got the original name, was Harry Unangst, if I got the pronunciation right, but it's Unangst. My German professor said I had Delikatessen Deutsch. My German pronunciation was not particularly good. So they both had nomenological reinvention. They both used name changes to make themselves more acceptable for their colleagues, and this may have given them a bit of imposter syndrome or something like that. So they are outside their community, even as in many ways they're accepted by their community. They both served the North African campaign during the World War II. They both had to participate in medical rationing, which was a difficult thing to do. They both exited the service as lieutenant colonels. So these were things they had in common. They could look up to each other. They could feel and did feel in their correspondence a kinship with each other. You got at the Harvard Library Papworth's letters to Beecher, and I read it in Beecher's letters to Papworth at the welcome. And if you put those two together, you can see how this comes out. So I think they were both kind of imposters, a little bit outside themselves, and that was a factor. And I think the fact that they were deeply religious, I'm not sure that's always the case, but I think it gave them a kind of grounding that troubled them. Now, Beecher, my PhD is in philosophy, and although I started out to be a historian, I mix philosophy and history, almost everything I write. Beecher was one of the worst philosophers I've ever read. He misquoted everybody. He never got a grasp on it. And when in the Harvard brain death report, the only moral authority he cites is a pope, and a Roman Catholic pope at that. He's not a Roman Catholic; he's a Methodist. So yeah, I mean, religion and morality were all linked in his mind, and they were clearly. I mean, Papworth goes on a campaign against organ transplantation because it violates Orthodox Judaism. So these are people for whom that's an anchor. I'm not saying that's an anchor for all the moralists. I noticed that one of the questions posed for the conversation is why the focus on religion with the blue and yellow. I did that because one of the questions raised by the organizers was, to what extent did religion play a role? And I think that it's hard to say what extent it was. People came from very different backgrounds, and we don't know who was practicing and who was not. We know in that particular pair, Beecher and Papworth, they both practiced forever. And that was an integral part of their lives. And in some way, you know, this may have, I don't know if Beecher has got a diary, but I would have loved, if there were a diary, I'd love to see how those tensions unfolded with what he was doing. But I think when he comes out against the state, that you can't give away your professional allegiance to the state, he's talking about himself. That's what he did in complying with the CIA and US Army experiments. So when he gave amphetamines to Dan Callahan, when Callahan was a graduate student at Harvard, he did that was to see whether or not if he gave amphetamines to soldiers, they could fight better and so on. So he had given up his professionalism for the state. And I think when you find the 59 essay, you begin to talking about Hitlerian, the abandonment of professionalism. He's talking about himself. He's got to be.
But he's clearly also a bad historian.
He's a bad philosopher. He's a bad philosopher. He's a very good researcher, though. I mean, when research on anesthesia, that part was good, but the rest, no.
That last comment, Bob, gets to another question that was raised in the chat around why would Beecher look at Nazi experiments? They were notoriously unreliable. And I think maybe, Sabine, you also probably have something to say about this. The extent to which Nazi research was unreliable, I think, is up for question. It was immoral. But immoral doesn't necessarily mean that it was scientifically poorly conducted research, or not questions that other researchers were interested in answering, et cetera. The sort of scientific rationality and the morals of the Nazi experiments can be separated. Unfortunately, it would be nice if those were completely interlocked.
Would be much easier. But I mean, the simple historical fact is that the United States military sent commissions into the concentration camps and gathered all the data sheets that they could get a hold of and sent those out, as I said, to 60 experts in the United States, who they asked to really evaluate all the various experiments.
How can we use this? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, the presumption was that this was potentially valuable research, even if it had been conducted unethically.
And I mean, what's really, I'm sorry, just to add to that, what struck me most when I looked at that report in the Beecher papers was the fact that they had gathered all these results in war-torn and really destroyed Europe within a few weeks or months.
Yeah.
And sent those out by October 45. These papers were with Beecher.
Yeah. Ira, I wonder if you want to weigh in on this question of we did ask you all to sort of emphasize a little bit, what is the role of being a Jew and being a whistleblower. And I think there's at least two, obvious potential connections in terms of medical research ethics. Being a Jew may make the Nuremberg medical trial more salient, right? It may just be more present in your mind because this is your community that was victimized under these circumstances in some instances. Or there could be a religious, so that's for the community, or there could be a religious thing. And I think that's the direction that you led us down a little bit. But I also feel like you kind of gave us both sides. There are aspects of the Jewish faith tradition which might lead one to be more likely to be a whistleblower, to see a moral wrong and be willing to stand up and speak about it. There may also be aspects of the Jewish faith tradition that might lead you to be quiet and to not confront and to not be willing to sort of speak up to power. And I'm wondering now whether there's a third issue, which we haven't really talked about, which is this notion of Jewish people as being a minority, as being outside the mainstream. I think Bob alluded to this as being, sort of outsiders. And I'm wondering how do you tie those together, if at all, in terms of thinking about who becomes a whistleblower, who is capable of seeing the moral wrong in front of us and willing to risk things in order to speak about it?
You're asking a really hard question for a number of different reasons. So I'm going to try and answer the best I can, and then if I have time, I'll answer Miriam's question about organ transplant, just because it's in the chat. So look, the first thing you got to think about is the Jewish community is not a monolith, not only in terms of denomination or in terms of geography, but even in terms of as much as we talk about groups are also consisting of individuals, and individuals have their own ways of being and how they're going to prioritize their values and their, for lack of a better term, risk aversion or consequences of acting on those values, right? So one thing you might even want to think about as a test question is those who were whistleblowers, were they American Jews or were they Jews from Europe, right? Because I know a number of Jews from Europe didn't speak about the atrocities of the Holocaust for decades. Some never spoke about them. They wanted to put the past behind them and move on to a new life. Some left the Jewish tradition. Some didn't. There were others that wanted to make sure that they spoke about the atrocities to make sure that it would never happen again. But I don't know if that was a vocal minority. I don't think that was a majority, especially if Jews of European descent who came to America after the Holocaust, right? When you think about it from the religion side, I think that's also difficult to put as a monolith also. Religion in general tends, and by the way, this goes back to ancient philosophy as well, in terms of attention, in terms of a person's purpose or a person's actualization. Is it selfish and individual? Meaning is my goal in life to commune with God in a spiritual, enlightened way and not really care about everybody else? Or is my religious fulfillment a moral mandate to seek justice in the world and care for the oppressed, right? So if someone who sees religion, forget Judaism, but religion in general, as a personal path to enlightenment, that's going to have a very different orientation of their responsibilities to others than if it was also a moral path, right? With regards to Jews in particular being a vulnerable group or a minority group, I think you also have to think about, especially in the beginning, and this goes to the test question of were they American Jews or European Jews, speak to the question of what I talked about in my response of efficacy and danger. If you don't trust the powers that be, that they'll take care of you, or that they are living in a just government themselves, you may think that whistleblowing is a right thing to do in theory, but not for you, because it's not going to be efficacious and it's just going to lead more harm, right? It somewhat speaks to Helen's comment of the risks of whistleblowing.
Mhm.
Like if the risks of whistleblowing are forget that it's not going to work and you're going to lose your job and you'll never be able to work again because you're known as a difficult employee or a difficult member of society. But if the risk of whistleblowing is your people are once again causing trouble, that creates a very strong impetus for parochialism and separation, as opposed to seeking a betterment of the world because you just don't think that you'll be accepted. So I think it's really difficult to talk about a Jewish motivation to whistleblow or not to whistleblow. I think what goes on in anyone's mind when you're thinking about whether to whistleblow or not, and we'll just, since we're talking about the American Jewish experience, so from the Jewish tradition is, how do you balance all of these competing factors to make sure that you do what you believe is right and what you believe you're empowered to do? I think that's what goes on. And therefore, it's not that it's an individual decision, but it's an individual decision recognizing the tradition from which one comes and the social context in which one lives. Right. Now, just real quick on Miriam's. So it's not that organ transplant is contrary to Jewish law. Organ transplant is in accord with Jewish law. The big question is which organ. When there was the big debate with at the beginning with organ transplant, it really spoke to heart transplants, because heart transplants were contingent on brain death, and there was still a big debate on whether brain death was considered a definition, or sorry, a criterion of death in accord with Jewish law or not. So it's not about organ transplants in general. So hope that was helpful.
May I come back to Beecher for a second?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, there was a question in the chat. Maybe as you come back, you'll have a chance to draw that in as well. The question was around, I lost that quote. Well, I lost that question, but Bob, when you speak now, would you mind, so say your word about Beecher, and then I'd love you to address John Murr's questions. He had a couple that I think are quite provocative. They are addressed in your book. He would like to know about the experimentation at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital and who was behind the revelations there, which draws in the question of Jewish participation in unethical experimentation historically, and then what went right when the CDC was relatively recently, just in the last decade, made aware of, or remade aware of, the Guatemala syphilis experiments, and immediately was on it, apologizing, digging in, trying to figure out, what happened, where are the records. Was that just the lesson of Tuskegee? We can't have, we can't hold back the second time around, or what else may have, prompted a more appropriate response in that instance.
So let me first do Beecher. Beecher's religion was full immersion Methodism, and he took seriously the idea of redemption, personal redemption. And to a certain extent, I think for him it would be, remember, he read the Bible, and not only read the Bible, insisted that his children read the Bible and that his son basically memorized it. So, and that would be both the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and the New Testament. So, I think he was looking for redemption because it's part of his religion, and that would have required full confession. He started, there's a nice piece in, I'm not going to find it right away, so I'm not going to go looking for it. There's send me an email, just say cite, and I'll give you the place where it is. Sue Lederer wrote a nice piece on this where Beecher writes a little note, why me? Why now? And he answers that. He says, I'm at the end of my career. I'm a researcher. They will take what I say seriously. And basically, I think it'll be effective. But he knows that he's in for a hard time once he does that. And in fact, his Harvard colleagues immediately denounced him publicly. So that there was that hard time. So Beecher, that was within his religious tradition. I think that was a motivator for him, outside of the fact that he was an imposter. He had imposter syndrome, always the outsider, trying to be the insider, having a name that wasn't his, and so on. What was the first of the two questions? The merits questions? Chronic disease. So it was a Sloan Kettering Memorial. Sloan Kettering, Dr. Chester Southam of Sloan Kettering was the experimenter. He approached two hospitals. One was a satellite of Sloan Kettering, and he did the experiments on post-hysterectomy, primarily white women. Then he wanted to do the same experiment. These experiments were implanting live cancer cells into people and explaining that they were routine tests for immunity. And they had tried to do it, telling people what they were doing, and everybody rejected, didn't want to participate. So he lied. He gave false information. So those were the two groups. He wanted to do it with terminally ill Jews. I think there were a dozen or 2 dozen patients at the Brooklyn Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital. And he wanted to do it in post-operative women at the Memorial Hospital. So at the Jewish hospital, 2 Jews protested to the board. The 2 Jews who did were rejected by the board. They resigned. One member of the board, Dr. Hyman, can't remember his first name, was a practicing Jew and a lawyer from Brooklyn. He took it to court, and the court censured Dr. Southam. They suspended his license and the license of the collaborating Jews for a year, and may have done something more. Dr. Southam was immediately elected vice president and then president of the American Cancer Research Experiment, who obviously saw nothing wrong. The experiments were the basis of a transition in treatment of cancer. So they proved valuable, even though, as I think many of the Nazi experiments, but Nazi doctor experiments, but in both cases were deemed immoral in retrospect. And the whistleblowers paid a price. They lost their jobs, they got jobs elsewhere, and so on. And Dr. never relented.
As a similar story with many of the Nazis, of course, who went on to careers after the war without punishment, never relenting, never expressing remorse. I want to thank you all so much for being with us today. I realize we've gone over a couple of minutes, and we could keep talking. I've got a bunch of questions still in the Q&A. We will circulate those Q&A questions to all of you so that we can give some at least typewritten answers to some of the questioners. This program has been recorded and will be posted to the website. It usually will be posted within a week. I want to remind the audience that there will be a survey. We use these surveys to help us formulate future programs and to generate questions and ideas for speakers. So please complete the survey when you get the email following on this program. Thank you again, Dr. Baker, Dr. Hildebrandt, Dr. Bedzo. It's been such a pleasure to spend a couple hours with you today. Take care, all.
Thanks a lot.
That's all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.